Following the death of Charles Gordon in Khartoum in 1885, one of his key lieutenants, German-born Emin Pasha, was left cut off from the world in the swamps of southern Sudan, facing the Mahdist forces alone. In an effort to save him, the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition set out in 1887. Led by Henry Morton Stanley, the man who had tracked down David Livingstone, it battled through hundreds of miles of uncharted and impenetrable jungle in the Congo. It took them 6 months to get through that 500 miles of hell. 2/3 of the force died of starvation. They battled pygmies who fired poison arrows at them. Porters were beaten to death. And one leader was even accused of selling a girl to cannibals so he could draw the grisly spectacle. It became both an epic but also chaotic and violent expedition into Africa's heart of darkness. The story begins with the death of Charles Gordon in Khartoum during the Sudanese Mahdist Revolt in 1885. Now, I've told the backstory to this revolt in several past episodes, so I won't go into all the details again now. Suffice to say that after the fall of Khartoum, only one man was left holding out against the Mahdi. Down in the very south, protected by the swamps of the Sud, one of Gordon's lieutenants still controlled the province of Equatoria. Emin Pasha. Mehmed Emin Pasha was born Isaac Edward Schnitzer in Silesia, then part of Germany, in March 1840. Schnitzer was born into a middle-class Jewish family, but when his father died, his mother married a Christian, and he was baptised into the Christian faith. Following his bloodfather's footsteps, he studied to become a physician, qualifying in 1864, whereupon he left Germany and travelled through the Ottoman Empire. In 1875 he arrived at Khartoum in Sudan. Now, at this time Sudan was controlled by Egypt, which in itself was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but increasingly doing its own thing. In Khartoum, Schnitzer adopted the name Mehmet Emin and started a medical practice in the town. In theory, he converted to Islam, although no one seems to be sure just how converted he ever really was. Nevertheless, this interesting character can claim to have been a Jew, a Christian and a Muslim in his life. Charles Gordon is remembered for his confrontation with the Mahdi in the 1880s, but what most people don't know is that this was his second term as governor of Sudan, and prior to that he'd been the governor of the southern province of Equatoria, in what is now the very southern part of South Sudan. And it was as governor of Equatoria that Charles Gordon took a shine to Mehmet Emin, whom he brought onto his staff. When Gordon was appointed to the top job in Khartoum in 1878, his first term as governor of Sudan, the Caliph of Egypt appointed Mehmet Emin, or Emin Pasha as he would now be called, as Gordon's successor in Equatoria. He would remain there for the next 10 years. Like Gordon, he became a bitter opponent of the local Arab slave traders. Muhammad Ahmed's Mahdist revolt erupted in Sudan in 1881. By January 1885, his forces had stormed Khartoum, killing Gordon in the process, and Equatoria was cut off from the outside world. What had happened to Emin Pasha, people wondered. No one knew. Probably he'd met the same fate as Gordon. And then in February 1886, after a year of silence, a Scottish missionary in modern-day Uganda received a message from the swamplands to the north. Emin Pasha was alive and well and holding off the Mahdist forces. However, his message went on, he really needed some help. That cry for help was picked up in Britain by the Scotsman newspaper and the Anti-Slavery Society, amongst others. With the death of Gordon, Emin Pasha, Gordon's loyal anti-slavery lieutenant, was seen as a beleaguered Victorian hero who needed to be saved from the same fate that had befallen his boss. A relief expedition was established. Not that Emin had actually asked to be saved, but hey, why let his sensitivities ruin a whole humanitarian project? Unlike the Gordon Relief Expedition, this was not a British military venture, nor was it a British government-directed mission either, although it did eventually gain some government funding. It was ostensibly a private mission. William Mackinnon, who'd made a fortune running a shipping line in India, and James Hutton, a Manchester merchant involved in the palm oil trade in West Africa, brought together a small group of like-minded, public-spirited citizens to form the Emin Pasha Relief Committee. Together they raised £32,000, which according to the Bank of England equates to about £3.5 million today, to fund an expedition to save Emin Pasha from the Mahdists. He then approached the explorer Henry Morton Stanley to lead it. Stanley, an American journalist born in North Wales, had famously led a similar type of expedition to find Scottish explorer David Livingstone. Now he was working for King Leopold II of the Belgians to establish his Congo Free State. If ever there was a misappropriate name, then the Congo Free State is it. The eventual exposure of Leopold's exploitation of the country and the barbaric treatment of his subjects caused an international outcry just before the First World War. That is a historical rabbit hole I don't want to go down today, but maybe in the future, if you're interested. Before I go on, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss future videos. As Stanley was employed by Leopold, the king insisted that the relief expedition travel through his territory in the Congo, rather than the slightly shorter and certainly easier route from the east coast at Zanzibar. I said that the expedition was ostensibly a private-funded humanitarian effort, but that wasn't the whole picture. There was another agenda at play apart from rescuing Emin Pasha: imperialism. For a start, the Germans were establishing a toehold in East Africa and saw Equatoria and Uganda as useful additions to their empire. Maybe Emin Pasha, originally a German citizen, could be persuaded to throw in his lot with them and help rapidly expand German influence in East Africa at the expense of their rivals, the British. They were opposed by a group of British merchants who had their own ambitions for East Africa. In fact, they would shortly come together to found the Imperial British East Africa Company. And two of the leading lights in that venture? William Mackinnon and James Hutton, the philanthropic backers of the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition. They were keen for Emin Pasha to request British protection over Equatoria, expanding their own sphere of influence and also blocking the Germans. And then there was Leopold of the Belgians. His pressure for the expedition to travel through his territory wasn't merely because Stanley was his employee. He harboured dreams of expanding his Congo Free State into the headwaters of the Nile, in other words, Equatoria. So a little bit more murky than the public were being led to believe. On the 1st of January 1887, Stanley arrived in London to huge public excitement to begin preparations. Consisting of nearly 1,000 men, the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition was to be the largest and best equipped of the European expeditions to Africa in the 19th century. A steel boat, the Advance, would be transported in 12 sections overland all the way to Lake Albert. There, it would be assembled for Stanley to travel up the waterway to meet Emin. The expedition also received a gift from Hiram Maxim of his latest Maxim gun. Everyone wanted to share in the limelight. Stanley was inundated with over 400 applications to join his endeavour. From all those applications, he chose just 10 Europeans to accompany him as expedition officers. 3 had travelled in Africa before, 2 of them as employees of the Congo Free State, and 1 as a big game hunter. 4 others had military backgrounds. Next, Stanley travelled to Egypt, where he obtained further funding for his expedition, before arriving at Zanzibar on the east coast of Africa. Here, he persuaded a notorious Arab slave trader, Tipu Tip, to rendezvous with him in eastern Congo, with additional porters for the second part of his expedition. The liberal press in Britain were horrified that their humanitarian expedition to rescue an anti-slavery champion was now reliant on a slave trader providing the muscle to carry the supplies. Never a man to worry about such sensitivities, Stanley took a boat around South Africa and arrived at the mouth of the mighty Congo River on the 18th of March, 1887. The proposed expedition route was arduous to say the least. Stanley would travel up the Congo River and then proceed up a tributary, the Arawimi, on boats provided by King Leopold. There they would be joined by Tipu Tip and the additional porters, before marching through 500 miles of uncharted territory to Lake Albert. Equatoria notionally extended down to the northern edge of the lake. Stanley would now assemble his steamboat and sail up the lake to meet Emin Pasha. The final part of the plan would involve bringing the families of Emin's soldiers and other employees back the same way as Stanley had just come, whilst he would accompany Emin and his men eastwards to Zanzibar. It was a massive undertaking. Nearly 2,000 miles by boat, a further 500 miles through an uncharted forest, and then well over another 1,000 miles to the east coast of Africa. What could possibly go wrong? Well, how about a combination of broken promises, lack of supplies, and poor leadership for a start? Oh, and there was one other small fly in the ointment. No one had actually asked Emin whether he wanted to be rescued. What he had actually asked for was help. From the word go, Stanley was faced with a massive logistical nightmare. Despite King Leopold's promise of steamboats to transport the huge numbers up the Congo, it turned out that only one actually worked, the aptly named Stanley. The expedition leader was forced to requisition 2 further boats, the Peace and the Henry Reed, from local missionaries, plus an uncompleted steamer which Stanley used as a barge. 4 boats was nowhere near enough to transport all his supplies, some of which were left at the home base. And that was the beginning of his second problem. Lack of food supplies hampered the expedition throughout the following 2 years. To make matters worse, the areas they travelled through relied on subsistence farming, so the local people had little food to spare to sell to hundreds of men passing through. Often he resorted to attacking their settlements and stealing what food there was. So an interesting humanitarian expedition. With food supplies dwindling, Stanley decided to split his column. Reaching Yambula, he determined to carry on towards Lake Albert, whilst a rear column would stay put, awaiting for the steamboats to return from a 4,000-mile journey down the Congo with more supplies. Whilst at Yambula, Stanley now heard from Tipu Tip. The slave trader refused to supply porters, as he claimed Stanley had not provided ammunition with which to trade with local tribes. Despite a lack of porters, not to mention food supplies, the impatient Stanley decided to move forward, overland, towards Lake Albert on the 28th of June. His route would take him through the dense Ituri forest. Even today, the Ituri covers 24,000 square miles. It would be the first time that the forest would be traversed by Europeans, a distance of 500 miles. The forest canopy was so dense that Stanley later said that in the whole 500-mile journey, they never came across a clearing larger than the floor of a cottage. Struggling through streams and thick mud, clambering over massive tree roots, cutting through what vegetation was in their way, whilst hauling sections of the steamboat Advance. Can you imagine just how physically and mentally demanding this journey, literally into the heart of darkness, was? It was made all the harder as the party started to succumb to starvation, as well as diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and ulcers the size of large mushrooms on their skin. And as if that wasn't enough of a challenge, they also had to fight off attacks from local pygmy inhabitants who mistook them for Arab slave raiders. The journey that Stanley had estimated would take 2 months turned into a 6-month nightmare. And if you're doing the maths, that's less than 3 miles a day. If you've got this far, then you're probably enjoying my work. In which case, please do check out my supporters club, where I host regular members-only shows and live discussions. Find out more by clicking on the link in the description below. Finally, they exited the forest and arrived on a hill overlooking Lake Albert, only to find no sign of Emin Pasha. In fact, locals said they hadn't seen a white man in years. Eventually, they did receive a message. The Pasha had been told that a large party led by white men were in the area and had come to the lake to investigate, although he hadn't got a clue about any relief expedition. Finally, the 2 men met on the 27th of April, 1888. It was 13 months since Stanley had arrived at the mouth of the Congo. Stanley was surprised to find that rather than looking like a beleaguered victim of the Mahdists, Emin Pasha was in surprisingly good health and didn't seem in the least bit worried about his current position. He and his men were turned out in immaculate white drill suits and red fezzes, a marked contrast to the dishevelled and half-starving relief party. The Pasha immediately sent for his own, rather ample food supplies for Stanley's men. And so, in one of those ironic moments, the rescue party were themselves being rescued by the man they'd come to save. It now transpired that Emin wasn't interested in being rescued in any case. Rather, he was keen for Stanley to provide ammunition and other supplies so he could continue to defy the Khalifa in Khartoum. All Stanley had was 13 boxes of ammunition. With that limited support, Emin Pasha now pondered his options. Fight on and keep Equatoria slave-free from the Mahdists, or join Stanley marching to the coast? After a month, with Emin still prevaricating, Stanley headed back into the Congo to search for his rear column, who had suddenly gone very quiet. In August 1888, he found what was left of the rear column about 90 miles upstream from Yambua. Just 60 men out of the 270 left behind were still alive. The rest were dead from starvation or had deserted. William Bonney was the only European there. The story that he told was one of complete chaos and disaster. Stanley had left the rear column under the command of William Musgrave Bartelott. The 29-year-old was a former British Army officer who had served in the Second Anglo-Afghan War and in the Camel Corps during the Gordon Relief Expedition. Bartelott had been ordered by Stanley to await resupply and then follow him. Henry Morton Stanley had then boldly marched off into the Ituri forest and hadn't been heard from for a whole year. In the meantime, discipline under Bartelott fell apart. He resorted to repeated floggings, during which at least 2 men died. William Bonney accused him of behaving like a fiend. Things then went from bad to worse, as Bartelott was shot dead whilst trying to interfere in a local festival. Bonney also reported that the last remaining European officer, James Jameson, was dying of fever. In his early 30s, James Sligo Jameson was the grandson of the founder of Jameson Irish Whiskey and was a naturalist and explorer who had visited Borneo as well as southern Africa and the Rocky Mountains. If Bartelott's violent and chaotic leadership was worrying, it was nothing compared to an allegation facing the dying Jameson. Bonney told Stanley that Jameson had purchased a young female slave and had given her to cannibals so he could record her killing and being eaten. In his diary, which was published posthumously, Jameson admitted buying the slave girl, but claimed he'd done so just in jest and hadn't expected the cannibals to proceed. However, William Bonney claimed that Jameson must have stuck around, as he had made drawings of the macabre event. Restoring some sort of order to the rear column, Stanley now marched what remained of them through the 500 miles of the Ituri forest to the shores of Lake Albert, arriving back there on the 16th of January 1889. He brought with him a further 36 cases of ammunition for Emin Pasha's soldiers. However, those soldiers had mutinied in October, fearing that Emin was about to abandon them. Emin and one of Stanley's officers had been placed under house arrest, but were allowed to travel down Lake Albert on the Pasha's own steamboat to meet the returning Stanley. On the 17th of February 1889, Stanley and his remaining expedition met Emin and 65 of his loyal soldiers above Lake Albert. With Emin still insisting on staying, Stanley eventually lost his temper and basically told Emin Pasha that he would be leaving for the coast of East Africa, 1,100 miles away, with or without him. With little control over his army or Equatoria, Emin Pasha finally agreed to accompany him. Stanley's Emin Pasha Relief Expedition, complete with the saved Emin Pasha himself, finally arrived on the coast of what is now Tanzania. They had travelled nearly 4,000 miles from one side of Africa to the other. It was a monumental physical achievement. Here they were met by the local German administrator, Hermann von Weissmann. Emin Pasha, formerly Edward Schnitzer of Germany, was feted by his fellow countrymen. He even received a congratulatory telegram from the new German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. At a celebration banquet hosted by the German administrator, Emin Pasha was so inebriated that he fell out of a second-floor window, which he had mistaken for a balcony, and was hospitalised until the end of the year. Whilst he convalesced, Stanley headed to Europe to receive the plaudits for saving Emin Pasha. Stanley arrived in Europe in May 1888 to a hero's welcome, the man who had saved Emin Pasha from the clutches of the Mahdists, even if he hadn't wanted to be saved. His book about the expedition, In Darkest Africa, sold 150,000 copies in just 1 month. But the adulation was short-lived. Word started to spread about the calamitous rear column, the brutalities on the expedition, not least from Bartelott, and the actions of Jameson. Stanley's own attacks on various tribes along the route brought back old accusations that he was more of a sadist than an explorer. It's been suggested that the expedition in general, and the rear column in particular, provided some of the basis for Joseph Conrad's harrowing novel, Heart of Darkness. The fictional Kurtz in the story has a strong resemblance to the actions attributed to both Barthelot and Jameson. I guess we'll never know, but Conrad was in the Congo at the same time and did write the novel just a year after the end of the expedition. And yet, for all its faults, and there were many, the expedition, led by Henry Morton Stanley, had travelled nearly 4,000 miles from one side of Africa to the other. 500 of those miles were through uncharted forest, whilst carrying a steamboat. To put that into context, that is further than New York to Los Angeles. All in an age when they couldn't rely on modern equipment, navigation, supply, or evacuation methods. It was an amazing physical feat, and was the last of the great European-led expeditions in Africa. And what of Emin Pasha? Well, he entered into the employment of the German East Africa Company. In October 1892, he accompanied an expedition into the interior of what is now Tanzania. Near the border with the Congo Free State, the implacable anti-slaver was killed by a party of Arab slave traders. His headless body was thrown into the bush, whilst his head was sent to a slave trading leader. The Emin Pasha Relief Expedition was soon forgotten to history, as was the man whom it claimed to be rescuing. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story. And if you did, then please join my supporters club. There's a link in the description below. Lots more stories planned, including the wartime service of actor Christopher Lee, plus the only man to have been awarded the Victoria Cross and the Iron Cross. In the meantime, why not check out another one of my videos, such as the episode about the attempt to rescue Charles Gordon himself in Khartoum. Thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.